Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Welcome back. So we've got about a half hour left of the dialogue and then another half hour for questions. And I wanted to let Professor Metzinger respond to this wonderful conversation about ethics and the world's greatest problems. It's a very, very beneficial discussion. And then after that, if you can, I'd love to hear you each offer your definitions of the mind and consciousness. We've used those words dozens of times, but it might be nice to understand what you both mean by those words. And then we're going to go into a conversation on no self for the rest of the half hour or so. So, Professor Metzinger, you wanted to
I
respond
just
to
want to be
Geshe.
very short before we move on. So you just talked about people getting overwhelmed by habituated patterns, right? That was your last point, and that's why it doesn't work. And we've been talking about the possibility of a secular spirituality or secular practice. And you know me, I'm this radical guy. Liberation also means liberation from tradition. No masters, no authorities, no belief systems, no organized illusion. But there is a possibility, I just wanted to strike it, that I am wrong and that this idea of secularism is wrong because a certain kind of organized religious delusion actually was the answer to this habituated patterns problem. That in the beginning, this was a very good, there was a good motive behind it to create a force in people's mind by, say, for instance, making them become Buddhist believers that helps them not to get carried back. And I just wanted to say that there is this dialectic, right, between radical secularism, letting everything go, liberating oneself from everything, and as a real embodied being that has these old, as you say, habituated patterns, installing a counterforce, which may need some illusion or some attachment. That's all. I didn't want to say more. So, Scott, you take it from here.
Sure, sure. And when you say delusion, it may be belief is how we call that in Buddhism. But yeah, I'd love to hear each of you. We're going to talk mostly about no self, I think, for the next half hour or so. But I'd love for you to back up and define mind and consciousness from each of your perspective, from the scientific, from the philosophical, from the Buddhist perspective, because we've used those words a lot, but are we talking about the same thing? So you can start if you like, Geshe, with the Buddhist perspective.
The Buddhist perspective. So consciousness, as we see, same, I think, in science, we have to have a very simple definition. Yeah, even Anil Seth also proposes that, and many others as well. So in Buddhism also we see a very simple definition. And that means clear and knowing. That's what consciousness is. That means there's clarity, things can appear to consciousness. And we have the capacity, consciousness has the capacity to know. Yeah, so there's two aspects. And other people like Anil Seth likes to indicate more in the form of an experience in any kind whatsoever, as he says in his book, Being You, right? So we start with a brief kind of definition of consciousness. So something that can experience something that can know something, and then we have the various types of consciousness. If you don't understand the types of consciousness, then you don't really understand what actually is experience and how is it experienced, or how do things are appearing and how do you know. Yeah, so we have the five sensory perceptions, of course, and then also we have mental consciousness, and that's kind of a quite unique division of mental consciousness, because that's the consciousness we're mostly interested in, because that's the consciousness that we can develop. Sensory perception is limited, but mental consciousness is something we can develop to the full extent, as my friend Thomas likes to achieve liberation. So that's possible with this mental consciousness to be liberated of any form of afflictions or negative thoughts or whatsoever. So that is been accomplished with mental consciousness. And then we have a various kind of collection of what we call mental factors. So you could think about certain properties of consciousness, like be able to concentrate or be able to analyze and things like that. So we classify about 51 certain texts. They classify about 51 of those mental factors. Yeah, so that's in short kind of what consciousness is, meaning it is clear knowing. And in Buddhism also we say it's not matter, it's not physical, although it has a correlation with the physical brain for human beings, for example. And that correlation also is causal, and I think there's two-way traffic. Yeah, so the brain could influence consciousness, and consciousness can influence the brain, as we can see in a neuroplasticity kind of science as well. So yeah, we have kind of a dualistic aspect of what you could say the mind and the brain as two different kind of natures or entities, so to say. Yeah.
So mind and consciousness, over the last 40 years of my academic career, which is now over, that was actually my core area, philosophy of mind. And as opposed to many other systems, there are now, of course, many perspectives what mind is. So on the one end of the spectrum, you have, for instance, eliminative materialists who say mind is just a culturally relative folk psychological term, means one thing in English, another thing in Pali, in different centuries or so. And it's not possible to enrich this concept by science. We just have to eliminate it, as Paul Churchland, the famous Canadian philosopher, would say, and just tell the whole story in neuroscientific terms. There is no such thing as the mind as a brain. And there's, of course, this other tradition, idealism, who would say there is only mind and physical properties only exist as content properties. And in the last decades, I mean, we've seen a wide and very well developed discussion of different positions to solve the mind-body problem. So to current philosophers, it's not clear, but I think it's fair to say that there are some people who defend a property dualism still, that there are two kinds of properties, but nobody, almost some theologians or philosophers of religion, believe that there's actually a substance, a mental substance, like Descartes thought 350 years ago. That's gone. Now, consciousness, we have a number of competing theories, and we've learned a lot during the last 30 years. We don't know what it is in the consciousness community. One can create a simple definition by saying it's, information processing systems like animals, human brains, they create models of reality. And consciousness is the fact that that reality can appear to the organism, its appearance. And of course, appearance is empty. That would be the bridge to your tradition. Our best theories say that they are virtual. The content of experience are virtual models in the brain. And exactly in that sense, they have no intrinsic essence. In exactly that sense, they're context sensitive and merely as if phenomena, as if, but not real. If I look at coming from the pure awareness, I would say something very similar to what you just said. Consciousness has to do with an organism having a model of its own epistemic openness. So epistemic openness means that you are open, that you know that knowledge could now take place. And in a very deep meditation, it is sometimes maybe possible to just experience that epistemic openness as such, the knowing that knowing could take place without any content, completely empty. And the idea is that every living organism is actually epistemically open to the world. So, for instance, Scott in dreamless deep sleep would be unconscious, but he is epistemically open to the world because I can rouse him. An alarm clock could wake him up, right? What he doesn't have in dreamless deep sleep is an internal model of its own epistemic openness. That happens in the moment he wakes up in the morning. And I think there are a lot of very valuable bridges to, say, Tibetan notions like primordial wakefulness and the primordial clear light. I often say everybody knows this. People who have never meditated who think the pure awareness, the awareness experience is something very rare or dramatic. The amazing thing is that everybody knows it. In the first 200-300 milliseconds of actually coming to in the morning, when you do not know who you are, where you are, what time it is, but there is a model of epistemic openness already. There's this knowledge that very soon something will be known. Normally we get out of it. And I'm always trying to explain this to non-meditators who just say this is all bizarre. Is imagine the last time when you really slept well, when you had a really good sleep last year. Maybe one morning where you woke up early because you were so well rested at 4:45. And imagine you didn't make a mistake of grabbing your smartphone or talking to another human being. In that sudden early being awake, you just sat on the terrace, maybe with your first cup of tea or coffee. The birds were singing, and then you had one thought. And then you had another thought. And in between, there's this vivid experience of wakefulness. And that is it. And everybody knows it, and nobody looks there. It's actually a natural gift that comes. And so I think from a scientific point of view, consciousness is having a model of your own current epistemic openness. And probably the solution is much simpler than we have thought. It has to do with that mechanism that creates primordial wakefulness, and my prediction is that if we have a theory of consciousness, we will suddenly read certain Tibetan texts with completely different eyes. And something that's maybe the last thing I want to say, what is consciousness? This idea of a clear light, right? One always forgets, if one hears this, that a clear light has no color. There's white light. That's not a clear light. There's red light, right? But there's something like the brightness itself. And I think people have seen this millennia ago in meditation. And I think modern consciousness science will find it eventually as that which enables everything else, on which then knowledge is superimposed later. But there are completely different people in the modern consciousness debate. For instance, there are people who say it's an illusion. Consciousness is an illusion. You just think you are conscious, but you never are. I don't know if you can relate to any of this, but that's how it looks from my universe.
Yeah, I mean, the clarity of the mind, of course, as I indicated in the Buddhist scriptures, we say clear and knowing, right? So that clarity is definitely, but also the thoughts that come after the clarity, after you wake up and you just have this moment for a split second and then you start thinking. But even when you start thinking, the thought process itself is also consciousness. It's just we describe it as a coarser form. Yeah, we have more subtler levels of consciousness and more coarser forms of consciousness. But all those types of consciousness, they have this underlying clarity. It's just by certain thoughts or distractions that you're not aware of the clarity, but it's the underlying nature of every type of consciousness.
And is that what you have just explained? Is that a metaphysics? Is this the Buddhist metaphysics of mind? Or is this phenomenology? Is this what people have learned through practice and are just describing on the basis of their own practice?
So it's both.
Aha.
Because the Buddhist practitioner, so to say, or a person in a secular, on a secular level in that regard, they look at these kind of techniques, or being these techniques being explained, or they study them, they put them into practice, and then they get this experience with this being explained in the scriptures as well. You know, if you do this in these kind of practices, you will get this and this experience. So then you can see that that's kind of an aspect of the reality, what consciousness actually is, and then you see if you get an experience, and then you relate it back to what has been explained by those who have experienced this before, by what we call the realized beings, so to say. And then you move in a particular direction, that you use those techniques they have used and they have seen it to be working, and then you try to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm. You know what struck me when I read all these hundreds of reports and we evaluated the statistics of all these hundreds, thousands of meditators, actually from 57 countries, that there's a small but strong core group who say it is not an experience. I found this puzzling.
It depends how you define experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you just in the moment of the clarity of consciousness, mm-hmm. then there's no thought of thinking this is an experience.
Got that? Yeah.
So then you're just in that nature of the mind, so to say. So that's why some people might indicate it as it's not really an experience as such. It's just being there and being within consciousness itself. The object of that consciousness is consciousness itself.
Mm-hmm.
It just depends how you define experience, right?
Yeah, but I want to go beyond concepts and theories. So one thing, maybe to get a different angle, that many people in my group are now beginning to intensively discuss. So in the book, I've said there's MPE, minimal phenomenal experience, pure awareness, and it can occur in dual mindfulness during the day, and it can occur in non-dual states to other with content. But there are also what I have termed full absorption episodes where pure awareness is the only thing that the practitioner sitting on her cushion experiences right now. Now, the question is, could this actually be false? That there is never a pure awareness experience because there's also cessation on the border, at least traditionally believed. So there are cessation experiences where all conscious experience ends. And maybe there is never full absorption into pure awareness. There's only states with minimal subtle fluctuations still in there. And then there is cessation. Do you have any view on that?
It depends on the practitioner and how genuine their method is and how high their development is, right? You can have meditators who haven't really studied meditation properly, and they might be in a kind of mental dullness state when there's no thought, for example. And that they indicate as being pure consciousness, but it's not a genuine form of pure consciousness. That happens, right? So that's one aspect. But if it's a genuine practitioner who has got the right instructions, so to say, and does the right preliminaries for that, and then eventually generates this pure consciousness and abides in that in the meditative absorption, then that's a reality, right?
Yeah, but that reality cannot be known. Because in the moment there is a knower, the state is gone. And it's also a methodological question, for people who want to go about this scientifically. What is the status of reports because if there had been a full absorption episode, non-dual, who or what is it that reports about it later? As if it was a part of your autobiographical memory as a self. As something isn't quite right there. Maybe you get the point. Maybe the human brain has strategies of memory systems that it can remember, because we're getting to selflessness, actually, right? So
No self.
there was consciousness without a self, say in a full absorption episode in some practitioner. And then there's a memory. And that memory is someone's memory as a self model and everything. Now, how does it get into the self model? That's a very interesting scientific question, because my academic philosopher colleagues would say something like, this is all garbage. These kinds of experiential reports are self-contradictory. How can you remember something where you weren't there? That is why we don't have to take it seriously. We don't have to take it seriously in philosophy of mind. We don't have to take it seriously in neuroscience. These are just some people who have some fantasies, and then they report about selfless states. How is that from your perspective?
I mean, first of all, like, these meditative absorptions, then what you experience is a subtle level of consciousness, right? So that subtle level of consciousness with the normal waking state, I mean, with many of the findings we see in having done a lot of research with advanced meditative practitioners, it's very clear that there is definitely a different aspect in brain activity being measured, for example, the high gamma waves, so that from an empirical point of view, you can indicate those absorptions has a kind of correlation with the brain activity, which is different from an ordinary waking state. So those things, empirically, we can prove. But then when a person goes into meditative absorption into consciousness itself, although there is no coarse form of itself appearing to that person at that time, but there's still a subtle level of a self present. Yeah, there's still that consciousness that appears to itself can still appear in a kind of way that sees it as a concrete entity or something like that, right? So that's still possible. Then when it comes out,
very interesting, that is very
because there's, to go back to what you read in one of the books you read, that you have to join this clear light with emptiness. That very much indicates that aspect, that even if you have a very subtle level of consciousness, the coarser levels of consciousness are not manifest, they dormant at that time. Also, the coarser levels of this self-ID, of holding on to an I, so to say, is maybe not that present at that time. But a subtler level is definitely present, because you experience consciousness as the self at that time, or this subtle consciousness as the self at that time. So in that regard, you still have a kind of a self that appears, but that self cannot be found among the different moments. And that's why when you're in that meditative absorption, then in advanced levels of practice, then we try to see where are you then? Where is this consciousness then? Are you in the present, the past, or the future? Can you find it anywhere? And then you come to the union of this most subtle kind of clear light mind with what we call emptiness, or the lack of an inherent, or the lack of an intrinsic self at that time. So that's also, we have to define that the apprehension of a self, or the appearance of itself, has different levels. That had levels in kind of these meditative absorptions, as well as in the ordinary waking state, or our day-to-day activities, so to say.
It has elements and layers. So, and that is actually connects your topic of non-self to the question of what is consciousness. So a term I use is non-egoic reflexivity. So the interesting thing that I think can reveal itself in meditation is that there can be a self-knowing quality. That you could describe it in different words: emptiness awakening to itself, or consciousness becoming aware of itself, awareness becoming aware of itself, but without any quality that we would normally describe to an ego, like an effort, agency, memory, even, or even a settled form of inner narrative or something like that. But it shares with the big fat ego illusion in the waking state, it shares this element of reflexivity. There is something that knows itself, but it isn't you.
Yeah, yeah. It isn't. Yeah,
That's how I would put it. You
yeah,
know?
yeah. So we say, for example, in school, Buddhist school called the Prasangika school, Buddhist philosophy, we say when consciousness experiencing itself, then it's not that there is a kind of from its own side existing consciousness there, because the moment you try to find it, it's past tense. It's not there anymore. So in that context, you actually see that is subtle consciousness that actually cannot find itself. Although on the conventional level, there are moments. And within a particular period of time of that meditative absorption, you could say, okay, this is the consciousness that is experiencing this kind of clarity that you can label in that way. But if you look for it, there's no such kind of independent moments of consciousness to be found, because it's just moment after moment. And then when you come out of that meditative absorption, and going to the other part of your questions before, is that memory comes into existence. But then memory is nothing else than just activating the kind of previous kind of seeds that comes to an end when you have a perception. For example, you have this kind of clarity of the mind, and that perception of that clarity of the mind, or that appearance of the clarity, comes to an end. But when it comes to an end, that information gets never lost. And that kind of information can be remembered, but there's no I that remembers it. It's just that continuity of consciousness itself that is a big factor in the memory of it. And it's not really there as a separate entity that is the person who remembers or the self that remembers. It's just the stream of consciousness itself that produces the memory of this event of the past.
This is probably as far as one can get in natural language, you know, with ordinary terms. And if it is right, it reflects, hopefully, the converging experience of centuries of committed practitioners. The question would be if one can take this to a higher level of precision, for instance, not in natural language, and use that to solve the problem of what awareness is in the first place. Yeah, you know, in science. Maybe bizarre, but again, I mean, you say memory is just reactivating the state. So there can be so practitioner, the organism that has sat out on the cushion reactivates. After the full absorption, reactivates the state again to a certain degree. And then I wonder if you would agree with that description, a certain delusion can happen. The egoic self model that is active again ascribes this to itself.
Yeah.
And says, I have had an experience, or I remember an experience of self-knowing pure awareness, but it is not true that you remember that, right?
There's no I, right?
No,
Yeah.
but it's
No joking. Yeah.
It's just it's an echo, or what is
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
An echo that people will falsely self-ascribe and then report verbally. How would we describe it in the best way?
So how do we describe what is memory, or how do we describe who is remembering something, right? So that's
No, the process by which somebody comes to say, the experience of pure self-knowing awareness has taken place.
Mhm.
How does that happen?
The pure experience of consciousness itself, you know.
No,
does
that somebody starts talking about it, that it has happened in the past. Do we have an idea about the mechanism?
I mean, we have an idea because we have experienced it in the past, right? So if we, whatever event we have experienced, if it's this meditative states or any form of experience, we can remember, right? So that information that of a particular experience that is never lost. And that's quite clear in the science. If you study hyperdementia, for example, of people who remember every event out of their life, it's very interesting science that the information basically never gets lost. So that capacity to access that information is present with memory. But there's not really a person who is remembering something, or in a sense of an independent entity as such. Is the same continuity of consciousness that remembers previous events.
The interesting question is, of course, if there could be islands of consciousness, for instance, in dreamless deep sleep, short flickers, or something that never turns into a real dream, which we never remember. If something like that is plausible, there might be something like that in meditation. There might be things happening in meditation that we never remember. Maybe we have micro cessations of which we have no memory. Or maybe we have islands of pure self-knowing awareness that we don't remember, but they did happen in that stream. That's a logical.
Yeah. So the answer to this is I think if you really study a person who has this hyperdementia and a person who does not have it, right? So that means a person who does not have it just simply doesn't remember it. But that does not mean that information is not there, because there are people who can remember. So in a similar way, if you have a meditation or a dream or an event, and there's just this island that is blank for you, you cannot remember. But later on, when the conditions are right, there's a possibility of remembering it. So that means that this memory can be developed as well. There are meditation techniques to increase these aspects of clairvoyance and things like that as well. So that means at a particular period of time, you cannot remember it. But then if you develop over time, or you have more clarity over time, then it's possible to remember it. Yeah, because that information
you see, that's an interesting aspect of what we talked about in the beginning, that people would say, practice with the motivation to be a better human being for all sentient beings in the planet, to become a more ethically sensitive, better person through meditation, after meditation. One could also sit down to meditate and think, I do not want to have conscious experiences. I just want to have states where then the information, as you say, is in this organism, but I don't even have to remember that, right? I do not have to have a specific, it's not necessary that the meditator afterwards remembers that something like this, as long as the information is embodied. Could be an attitude, right?
I think we're going to transition. Let me let Geshe answer, and then let's go to audience questions.
Sure.
Oh my God!
So it could be, it could be an attitude, but you can never really say, "I don't want to experience consciousness now."
You can never say again.
I don't want to experience consciousness now at that moment. Yeah, because you cannot escape. Because what are you? You are this continuity of consciousness. You cannot walk away from it. You cannot walk away from what you are, right? So in that way is kind of the conscious experience we have as a person on the conventional level, we can never escape, right? We can never say, now I don't want to think, or now I don't want to experience consciousness, full stop. That's just merely not possible. Yeah.
All right. So let's entertain some of the great questions coming in from the audience.
So we have a question from B. I have a son who is 100% materialist and agnostic, believing mind is ultimately reducible to matter. How do I introduce to him the Buddhist idea of mind without imposing on him Buddhism?
Yeah. So if he, first of all, you have to see if he's interested, right, in mind. Otherwise, it doesn't have much benefit, maybe. But then just talk about, disturbing emotions and how to deal with disturbing emotions. You don't have to talk about that consciousness is something separate than the brain. You can just still have an idea of or just don't have no idea at all. Just think about that these disturbance of mind, these destructive emotions, so to say, they come up, they abide and disintegrate. And you can work with it in the sense that you can eliminate them or reduce them in their power. So then those kind of aspects are very secular in nature, and you don't have to work about or think about any aspect of the dualistic aspect of mind-brain problem or something like that.
Yeah, but aren't there also strictly materialist schools of Buddhist philosophy?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, true. Yeah. But that's, so in Buddhist philosophy, that we have various levels of Buddhist philosophy, and then we study all of them in order to shape our mind for the most subtle interpretations. So we study them all and we try to understand each and every level, and then we prepare ourselves to the more subtler interpretations. Same as we talked about the aspect of consciousness itself, to be able to recognize this primordial clarity, and then later on to join it with emptiness, for example. So in a similar way, we go to the Buddhist philosophies and then eventually look into the most subtle or the most profound interpretation of consciousness or reality. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's another question here from the Lama Yeshe Wisdom Archive. So there is agreement that the number of suffering beings will only increase. For Buddhist practitioners, the intention is to free all beings from suffering. Dr. Metzinger notes that the number of people who are doing these practices is relatively small. How can we promote and support altruistic solutions for all in our human community and not fall prey to elitist approaches, such as the hybrid, natural, artificial solutions that Dr. Metzinger say are critical, that maintain existing social structures of unequal power and wealth, essentially leaving most people behind? And that's quite a long question, so just say if you'd like me to repeat any part of it.
It's a very good question. I do not have the answer to this. I do not have the answer. But I think you're touching basically all the relevant points.
Yeah, I mean,
it cannot be scaled. That's a possibility, The world could be like this, that it cannot be scaled.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, it's not easy, but what we discussed before, just the education of the mind, I think that's very crucial, and that has to be more accessible in the educational systems in the different countries. But yeah, if the politicians are not interested, then also we don't go right direction, right?
Yeah, why should they be? How does one become a politician? Why should they
Maybe
be
we should all become politicians instead of scientists.
Oh, it's an ugly environment, I think.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, TikTok is going to educate the minds of our children.
Okay. That looks very promising.
Yes.
All right, Matt.
Yeah, we have another one here. Hi, Geshe Namdak and Professor Metzinger. I'm a practitioner and academic researcher in consciousness, focusing on non-dual states within psychedelic experience and Buddhist meditation in the Nalanda tradition. I've been reflecting on what's missing in secular meditation and psychedelic experiences, and it seems the issue lies in the lack of a framework or view. I hypothesize that the Madhyamika view doesn't need to function as an ontological position, but rather as a deconstructive methodology applicable to all positions. I believe this reframing could be deeply beneficial, regardless of belief system. I would greatly value your thoughts on this perspective.
So this is very interesting. I think let's take another angle on this. States of consciousness are models of reality. Even in animals who cannot speak or think or create theories, they create objects, colors, smells, desires, and stuff like that. So there's an evolution of conscious reality models. And human beings have developed a certain tradition, and the tradition is we create altered states of consciousness, step one, through rhythmic drumming, through dancing, through sleep deprivation, through fasting, through meditating, through praying, through very good modern tools like psychedelics, for instance. Then we create alternate models of reality in our brain. Afterwards, step two, we interpret them as it pleases us, right? So for most of us, one of the deepest emotional needs we have is mortality denial. We want to find proofs that maybe we are not impermanent in some real sense, that maybe it will go on after life. And then we interpret altered states. And I would even claim that for the large majority of meditators, that is probably maybe what you call the missing frame, in secular meditation or so. That what really motivates it may actually not be the practice itself. Is the suspicion I'm increasingly having, but what you've called that view or that frame. I am an XYZ type of Buddhist on a gradual path, and and I will maybe return. And then there's this nice trick in Buddhism. Catholicism is very primitive. They just say there will be resurrection of the dead, period, and people believe it and they're happy. And in Buddhism, it's a little bit more subtle. So you have two possibilities. Either what one of my favorite Swiss Buddhist teachers calls Giga Bingo, right? Either Giga Bingo happens, liberation, or poor little ego has to be reincarnated again. Both cases is easy to accept. So if you create a narrative, a view, a frame, as you say, onto your own altered states in your practice like this may actually be what you have the feeling is lacking in psychedelics and what is lacking in secular practice, but which actually creates the motivation to go on. And I know most of you will not like to hear this, but it could be a driving motive behind it, to tell an overarching life story, which also has the nice feature, it will not end with this life, and I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we have to be very much aware of this mechanism in us as committed practitioners, that mechanism that is actually not interested in the practice itself, but in telling a very sweet and sexy story about what is happening during the practice afterwards. I hope that's not too dark for you, but I think that's a problem we have to face, right?
Yeah, and also I think what is important, I should see, with development of the science of consciousness and particular meditation, in this case secular meditation, I think for more collaboration should be happening between the scientists and the meditators, because often the scientists, they measure things, but they don't really know what they're measuring. They don't have the knowledge of different levels of meditation, and the meditators, they don't know what can be measured. So I think the collaboration between the two is very much needed. It's happening, but not enough. And then you can fill in these gaps much better over time. Yeah.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt.
Question here from Debbie. Can a person with dissociative identity disorder ever get back the memories of what happens during dissociation that they have no recollection of?
Well,
quite a specific question.
I've actually looked into this, but many years ago. There's a host personality, and then there are subpersonalities, and it's complicated. The memory relationship. The host personality may not remember certain things, And one of the sub-personalities in a dissociative state may have access to information, as Geshe would say, that the system doesn't have access to in the state where the so-called host personality is in control. I think the most interesting thing this phenomenon shows is that there's no solid self, and that there can be competing self models in one of the same organism. And I don't know what the current scientific facts are, but there are memory losses. Many people with dissociative identity disorder have to be shown that there are pieces of clothing in their cupboard which they haven't bought. And there have been cases of people who deny that they have this disorder and could only be convinced by being shown that they are already also in treatment with another psychiatrist, that this is not the only psychiatrist they're going to. That has happened, in the real world.
Yeah. So I haven't really looked into this in great detail, but just that memory can come back. That's very interesting research done with what we call the deathbed recovery. It's a very interesting phenomenon. It doesn't happen very often, but people with Alzheimer or brain tumor or severe mental issues or severe mental challenges, then what happens at the time of death, when consciousness actually becomes more subtle and is less dependent upon the physical brain, then people get clarity back or remember people again or remember things out of their life. And that can be just a few days or just a few minutes or a few seconds or so. Yeah. So that's a very interesting science as well, that there are not many cases, but there are cases like this, the deathbed recovery. Yeah.
Maybe one more question, Matt?
Yeah, so we have another question here from Kim. So what are your views on transgenerational trauma, the collective unconscious, and karma at both the individual and societal levels, and how might these concepts be connected?
Collective karma? That's the question, right?
Yeah, so what are your views on transgenerational trauma, the collective unconscious, and karma at both the individual and societal levels, and how might these concepts be connected?
Yeah. So, I mean, in 2 minutes. Okay. If your parents, of course, you would have a particular kind of DNA or kind of gene structure, then there's, of course, also karmically related with you, because you have created the causes to have that. That's one aspect. And then how this relates then to an experience of what we call karma. Karma is basically what we call the cause and effect relationship within the continuity of consciousness. And we talked about information theory a little bit, that whatever has been experienced in the past, that can be remembered or that can be activated and can be experienced. And then if you have a kind of collective karma, where we sometimes talk about, that doesn't mean we have all the same or part of the same consciousness. That's not the meaning of it. It's just we experience a similarity. For example, we all have the karma, or we have created the causes, let's put it that way, to die in a plane crash. But some people survive and some don't. So then is a collective karma means the individuals have a similarity in having created causes to crash in an airplane crash. And some also have the causes to die, and some do not have the cause to die. And even among those who die, people die in various ways, right? So various causes of death can be one part of the body, other part of the body. And so it remains individual. So we always say that consciousness is subjective and consciousness is individual, but we can have similar experiences or in similarity in an experience, so to say.
I do know that there is science and new knowledge about transgenerational memory in cultures, but I don't know that. I cannot report on this, but we're learning more, and there's clearly something like this. Just think about the country I'm coming from, Germany. The atrocities that have been committed by these people here. And of course, this affects children and youth and grandchildren to this day to grow up and to learn in high school what crimes their forefathers have committed, which were arguably the greatest in the history of humankind. So there's very clearly a history of trauma, but to be a party pooper again, if we wanted secular spirituality, of course, karma and rebirth in terms of moral causation, that there could be moral causes from one organism to the next wouldn't have a place in a secular thing, because you just cannot argue that anything like moral causation across biological organisms exists. There's no empirical evidence for it, and there's no rational argument for it. Same with reincarnation in a strict sense. I know that there are all kinds of ways around it, and storehouse consciousness and what have you, and stories, but that is something, if anything like a secular Buddhist practice could exist, that prime example of would probably have to go. Karma and reincarnation, I don't know if you like it or not, but I don't see how that could be secularized or naturalized, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my opinion is slightly different in that regard. I think it can be
Surprise.
quite secularized, and because if you follow in particular interpretation of karma, of how it functions, it's kind of information theory. Yeah, it's very similar to what we just talked about habituated, that there's information that has an effect on future forms of perception, that has an effect on future forms of experience. So in that regard, it's quite scientific. In a similar way, reincarnation, for that matter, if you look at, is there consciousness without a physical brain? Or is there consciousness possible, of perception possible, without a physical brain being active? Then if you look in the near-death experience, in particular, the one being examined by Pim van Lommel, who's got very good reviews in reviews and papers like in The Lancet, that his research seems to indicate that 93% of people who have an out-of-the-body experience during a cardiac arrest, when between 10-20 seconds the oxygen flow to the brain stops and the EEG goes flat, and according to medical science, valid perception is not possible at that time. But then, if according to his data, it seems to indicate that 93% of what people perceive during this state, when they're clinically dead, it seems to be valid. And it is then validated by having seen the doctor doing something, having seen put their glasses or the dentist somewhere that they shouldn't have known because they were dead at that time. And that can be validated later on. So that's very interesting science, to look into the possibility of valid perception where there's no measurable brain activity being present, for example. Or you look into Stevenson's research of children remembering previous lifetimes, that information is carried from one personality to the next. And that's a very interesting aspect, especially if you combine it with the birth marks of the cause of death. And so that means the cause of death is reflected in a birthmark in the present or current personality. There's very interesting aspects to if you look at those aspects, and then the logic that consciousness can only be produced by its previous moment, then you can put it in a very secular way, as well as karma with information theories, and as well as these aspects of, is there consciousness possible without a physical brain or not, in the near-death experience, for example. So then it's a very secular approach that is possible, and it's very interesting to, I think, and needed to do some more research in that direction. Yeah.
Right. Well, maybe that can be the basis for another conversation. This was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed observing and moderating. Thank you, Geshe. Thank you, Professor Metzinger, for the
Thank you
gift
for
of
all
your
the work
time.
you put into this.
Yeah.